Direct from Fort Meade, Maryland, this is DINFOS Live.
Hello and welcome to DINFOS Live. I'm Major David J. Murphy, a DINFOS instructor and your host for today's program. On this month's episode, we'll be talking all about civilian sector public relations and crisis communications in the tech and gaming industries. To help us talk with this particular issue and discuss this particular topic, we have today's guest for today's show, Rostra founder and former Activision Blizzard Chief Communications Officer, Ms. Lulu Meservey. Thank you for joining us on the program, ma'am.
Thanks for having me.
Please have a seat. All right, well, thank you again so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here today. Really eager to talk to you about this very important topic.
I appreciate it.
Before we go on with our conversation, though, of course, I want to remind everyone that if they have questions for our guests, to please enter them in the chat below, and we might just read your questions on the air. In fact, I challenge you to ask just one question of our guests. See if you can do that for us. All right, well, let's go ahead and get on with the show, shall we? Mm-hmm. So first and foremost, ma'am, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background with public relations, and also your background with the tech and gaming industry?
Sure. Yeah. So people think of me now as a comms person, but until pretty recently, I'd never done comms a minute in my life. And it actually relates to how crises come about, which is they're nowhere and then all of a sudden they're upon you. And that's what happened with me in comms. I had actually started and co-founded a PR agency, having never done comms before. I was Googling what is PR. After being the co-founder of this agency, I figured I better find out real quick. From there, I was at my own company for about 6 years, then went to go run communications at Substack, then joined the board of directors of Activision Blizzard, the gaming company, as you know, and then went in-house as the CCO and as the head of corporate affairs. During that time, we successfully completed an acquisition by Microsoft, and then so we were absorbed into Microsoft, and I left Microsoft earlier this year to start my own company, which is called Rostra, which helps founders of tech companies go direct with their communications. Wow,
that's pretty cool. Now, that's an interesting name. What does Rostra mean?
Okay, so the Rostra was the speaker's platform in ancient Rome. It was there during the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, and it was the place from which people would make their case to the public directly. So you would stand up there, you would give a speech. Caesar's eulogy was given from there, and that was kind of the turning point of public opinion a lot of times. And there was nothing between you and the crowd. You just had to face them and give them your best effort directly, and that's what we help founders to do, so I thought it was an appropriate name.
Oh, very appropriate. Awesome. Well, let's talk about crisis communications, because that's what we brought you on here to talk about. Talk to me specifically about your overall philosophy as it relates to crisis comms.
Yeah, I think most people think of crisis comms as what you are doing in a crisis, but I think of crisis comms as what you are doing in peacetime, anticipating a crisis, plus during the crisis, plus afterwards. So there's really three phases. There's the before, the during, and then how you get back up and recover from it afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk a little about that before aspect, right? Because you probably want to prepare before a crisis happens. So how do you prepare for any sort of potential crisis that the organization you're communicating on behalf of might face?
Yeah. The defining feature of a crisis is that trust collapses. Some crises are your fault, some are not, some are mechanical failures, some are data breach. There's all these different aspects of a crisis that might change, but the central thing that never changes is that trust has collapsed and you need to win that back. So from there, what you know is that before a crisis starts, you need to have the things that you can lean on when the trust has collapsed. What I mean by that is you are going to need relationships. So you need to have those relationships in place before you need them. You need to have the right contacts. So whether it's press contacts, influencer contacts, know who those people are before. Don't be scrambling in the middle of a crisis to Google who your beat reporters are, to Google who the influencers are. That should already be in place. And probably the most important thing is inside your organization, what gets elevated to whom, and who belongs in the war room, who has what roles and responsibilities. Those are things that you need to sort out in advance. So I actually think you guys do a lot of tabletop exercises and wargaming, and that is super helpful for companies to do, because it forces you to realize, oh, wait a second, this thing happened at 3 in the morning. our CEO is overseas. He's not going to wake up for another 3 hours. Do I wait the 3 hours? All these small points of friction during a crisis add up to become potentially catastrophic, but during peacetime, you can actually think them through more methodically. So who belongs in the war room? What are the triggers for escalation? Who should escalate to whom? Do you have their numbers? Are they on Signal? Are they on WhatsApp?
Yeah.
Do you even know whom to reach? And then who are the influencers? Who are the people who cover you? Who's going to be calling the board? Who's going to be talking to customers? All of that has to be well worked out ahead of time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, you mentioned tabletops and exercises. In fact, we're doing an exercise over at the Defense Information School right now for our Public Affairs and Communications Strategy qualification course. But I'm just curious, from a corporate perspective, how does like a large company like Microsoft or another organization handle or manage? Do they have exercises? Do they do that type of training? Is there a mechanism in place within the corporate infrastructure to enable that?
It really depends on the company, and it'll be spurred by a couple things. Sometimes the board will ask the company to be more prepared. Sometimes the CEO will have the foresight to decide to do that. I think a lot of times the head of comms should take that upon themselves to run that. I know a lot of really good heads of comms that have taken that initiative to get their CEO and C-suite in a room to spend a day doing that.
Yeah.
So it depends on the company, but I would say that right now, companies in tech, in AI, in defense, all of these, a lot of West Coast companies that don't have a culture of wargaming or tabletops the way that you do could probably benefit from it the most.
Okay, wow, very interesting. Can you tell me about some significant examples that you faced in the world of crisis comms and kind of how you overcame those examples or those instances and kind of what lessons you learned from them?
Yeah, so I got pulled into a really massive data breach.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, sounds fun, right?
Oh, yeah.
So the before part had all not been done.
Right.
And I don't blame the company for this. It kind of came out of nowhere. So I got pulled in like in media res as it was happening.
Yeah.
The lessons that I took from that are, this is when I started first realizing that there's a before, a during, and an after this. It's not just the during part.
Sure.
But something that became really clear is that in a crisis, the CEO will tend to defer to the lawyers.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of reason for this.
Sure.
You want to minimize legal risk, and the lawyers are very authoritative, and you should listen to them.
Of course.
However, I think that people overly defer to lawyers as a crutch out of fear and let it override your own judgment. Because as the CEO or as the founder, your job is to take input from a lot of different people and then work out what is the net overall best thing for the company. Sometimes the best thing for the company is not minimizing legal risk at every turn. Sometimes the right thing is actually to optimize for long-term trust and transparency over the more short-term and immediate legal consideration, like don't apologize, don't say anything, don't take accountability, it could be used against you.
Right.
You might have a situation where it's better for that to be used against you, or better to take a little bit of risk there, but to have your employees and customers know that you actually care and that you're on top of it. That might be net better.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about transparency, because I think that's really important. Obviously, you know, the military and we strive and try to ensure transparency as much as we can, but there's also operational security concerns that we have to take into account. I imagine on the corporate side, there's also those competing interests of wanting to be transparent, but also sort of the desires by your leadership to keep some information close hold. So how do you balance that when you're communicating with the public, especially during a crisis?
Yeah, well, there's two things. One is that you can help people understand there are reasons you can't share information. Like, people don't know the difference between you not being transparent and you having nothing to hide, having something to hide. Like, it looks identical from the outside.
Sure.
So the least you can do is tell them, here's something that we are looking into right now. We need to respect the privacy of so-and-so.
Sure.
We need to follow certain laws. Like, just help educate people on your own obligations and that you'll do your best within those obligations. That way, it lessens the risk that they will jump to their own conclusions about why you're staying so quiet or why you seem to be so cloak and daggers about it. And then the second thing with transparency is it's a long-term game. It doesn't mean that you have to be transparent in the moment with everything, but that over time you build the habit of transparency such that, let me give you an example. If you, as a matter of habit, are always informing your employees and customers whenever you can, then if you're quiet for a day or two, they'll actually cut you a little bit more slack because they'll maybe understand that once you have something to share, you will.
Yeah.
So I think it's not about in the moment, do I have to say something right now? It's let's think about this over the course of a week or a month or a year.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we've talked about transparency, and I think the communities that you're engaging with really do value that, just like the communities we do. And so when you're engaging with the gaming community, for example, you know, how do you engage with this usually highly vocal group in terms of a crisis? How do you manage their expectations, but also try to leverage their passions?
Yeah. The gaming community is so special because to them, the games are not just games. The games might be the way that they met their spouse.
Yeah.
The games might be something that they enjoy with their family and their kids. Right?
Sure.
We talked about that.
Yeah.
So it's deeply personal and they're passionate about it. It's an emotional issue. So first, just to understand that and take that seriously, as people in the industry know. Secondly, they're extremely online. And that's the same with people in the tech community too. It's a broad term, but people who are super into tech and follow tech companies.
Yeah.
Very, very online, very vocal, and they're connected not just to you with your megaphone, but to each other. And so information can spring up from anywhere in that network and spread throughout the network. It's no longer just people are waiting for you to hold forth with your megaphone. So I would say, number one, it means a lot to them. They take it seriously, and we need to take it seriously. Number two, we don't have a monopoly on the information that they get. They could get it from anywhere. And number three, in terms of trust, they trust human beings more than they trust corporations.
Right.
If you must speak as a corporation, at least have a human being do it.
Sure.
You know, don't issue an unsigned press release or like a tweet from the corporate account. If it's during a crisis or recovering from a crisis, you need to be building up trust, and people trust people. So you got to put people out there.
Let me ask you about a case study that just recently came about within the tech industry. Are you familiar with Marquez Brownlee, MKBHD?
Yeah.
Are you familiar with his recent speeding controversy?
Yes.
From your perspective, again, you know, in the tech industry, very vocal, very online, right? As soon as that happened, there were videos that were highlighting it. He tried to hide it by, you know, excising the clip from his video that was about it. You know, he put out a release, I think, on X or something to apologize for it. How do you think that specific crisis, you know, from your perspective, was handled? And is that the type of thing like that you would have handled that way, or would you have done something different from your perspective?
Yeah, it was a bummer for him because he had kind of a string of things that made people upset. He had the wallpaper app and then this, and so it felt like a pattern of people were in the mood to dunk on him.
Sure.
And so all of that just came out. If this had happened when he was on a high, which was just a few months before that, I think it actually wouldn't have been so bad. But people's moods kind of shift, and this was like a mood against Marcus, so it was already not in his favor. I think his statement was really good. I think his statement was very well done, and what I liked about it specifically was he addressed it head on. He said that what he did was wrong, and he pointed out the fact that he was now addressing it, and he might give it the Streisand effect, where he's going to amplify it by that happening, but everything on the internet lives forever, and he's going to document it. And so if he had done that earlier on, I think it would have been much better if he had done it more quickly.
Right.
I think better to do it than to not, because everything does live forever. And so for the record, he has apologized and he has taken responsibility, as opposed to the annals of the internet say that he doesn't care.
Right.
But the fact that he blurted out and then there was that period of time before he took responsibility, I think is really what got him.
Well, you know, in that specific instance, right, because we were talking about legal liability, right, and the sort of stress or the emphasis of lawyers to potentially, I would say, prevent communications, right? In his message, he admitted to breaking the law, right? He committed a felony in terms of speeding 3 times over the speed limit. So, I mean, that's a a bold move, isn't it, from his perspective, or do you think that that was calculated and ultimately he had to say something? He couldn't hide behind the fact, because he did do it and it's documented.
Yeah. Well, this is where, if you're the CEO of the Marcus Brownlee company and you're being asked, should we, the company, take accountability and actually admit to breaking the law,
Right.
On one side is the added, like the marginal added risk of how much worse you're making it by the admission,
Right.
which I think was very minor considering that people had evidence. Like there was video evidence already, he was already caught, so it wasn't like you're going from 0 to 100% confirmation. It was, you were already at like 99.8% confirmation, you took it to a 100.
Yeah.
But on the other side of the ledger, by coming clean about it, he buys a lot more trust back for his future endeavors. Like history is long and he's a young guy and he's going to be doing so much more. And so for the rest of his life to be known as somebody who admits it when he does something wrong, I think so far outweighs the marginal 0.2% added legal liability on this side of the ledger, which is the thing I was saying earlier that CEOs sometimes don't recognize. They're only looking at the side of the ledger of potential added legal liability. They're not looking at the other side of the ledger of what the earned or lost trust is worth.
Right. So you'd say it's probably a difference between looking at the short-term impacts versus the long-term, essentially loss in trust, right? Yeah, absolutely. We talked about social media, YouTube. Obviously, that's a rife for influencers. Talk to me about the role that influencers play in media relations as they relate to crisis communications, whether how we leverage them or enable them or interact with them.
Yeah, well, there's different types of influencers. There's influencers as a term of art, which is like people who literally get paid, sometimes tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to post, and this is their job and profession. And then there are people who are influential in certain communities and they're just sharing their opinions. I'm going to lump them in a little bit for the sake of simplicity. I'm mostly talking about the latter group. I think you can pay anyone to say anything, but the latter group is more trusted, more organic.
Yeah.
It used to be that they were downstream of press, that press would be the first to find out information and break a story, and then these people would opine and comment on it. But more and more it's reversed, where they're upstream of press, and they are getting intel about what's happening. They're in touch with people at the companies, and they're breaking news, or they're making commentary that breaks news, and then it shows up in the press later.
Right.
So when I was at Activision Blizzard or at Substack, there were plenty of people in our community, a gamer, a writer, who would know about things happening inside the company before I told the press.
Yeah, wow. So when you're kind of in that role, is there any particular areas where you have to be careful in terms of how much you kind of let them in or how much you engage with them, or do you kind of just you be open and honest because ultimately they are a mechanism to many different people who are also going to want them to be open and honest?
Yeah, there's the question of what information to share, and then who you share it with, and then when you do it. So for the what information to share, if it's confidential, period.
Yeah.
There's no world in which you tell a few people and expect it remains confidential. And so if it's out, it's out. So truly confidential information, don't say it to anybody, no matter how close to you, no matter how influential. If you're talking to a reporter and it's off the record, still don't say it. If it's truly confidential, don't let people know.
Right.
If it's something that you are planning to release and then you do want out in the world, it's okay to tell, but now you have the levers of whom you're telling and when you're telling. Okay. So simply by telling gamers in the community or writers in the community before you tell the entire world means something special. It means that you're on this journey with us and you're on our team, you're on our side of the fence here. You're not just being lumped in with the general public. And symbolically it's meaningful, but also pragmatically it can be really meaningful. Like we've put out news, my various teams have put out news through influencers that we thought was more effective than just giving it to the media, because these influencers were super fans and they really understood it, or they were really excited about it, or personal users, so it's different.
Well, that's an interesting way to kind of treat that, because then the media will pick up what the influencer is saying, right? Interesting. You mentioned games, and I'm a gamer myself, so I'm just curious, do you play games yourselves, and if so, what are you playing? Also, you mentioned you have children. What are your children playing?
My children are too young to be playing anything, although people have accused me in a derogatory way of looking like I'm good at Candy Crush, and I am extremely good at Candy Crush.
Yeah.
And so there have been a few times when I'll tell I've explained to my kids, this is what I do, and here's one of the games that our team makes, and here's how it works. As we were talking about, I want to start Factorio, but I need to wait for a non-busy week because I've heard it's incredibly addictive and then you won't put it down. So I'm kind of waiting for the right time. But the last one that I got into was Diablo 4. And at the beginning, I wasn't sure I would get into it. I was sort of like, well, I'd never played any of the previous Diablos. Let me check it out. Waited till my kids went to bed. I played with my brother-in-law. And I actually got into it more than I expected because the first few minutes, I kind of thought like, all right, dungeon crawler, it's going to be repetitive. It kind of sucks you in. And actually for last year's BlizzCon, which is our big event, I did a cosplay as a rogue, which is not what I played, but it was the best cosplay. I put it together myself with help from some of the people from the company as like advisors because I'd never done it before.
Oh, wow.
So that was the last one,
It's nice when you have that official channel to the folks who actually design the costumes and design the artists and whatnot. So that is pretty neat. You know, we've talked a lot about crisis communications from an external perspective, right? How does the audience and the stakeholders who engage with, you know, our organization react to something that we've done? But let's talk a little about the internal audience, right? Because I think that's a pretty important focus, and we need to ensure that we're communicating with them as well. So what do you do during a crisis, specifically when you're focusing on the internal audience?
Yeah, okay, so this is a really good question because the internal audience is the most important audience, and it's also the most underrated audience. I think a lot of leaders take for granted that their people must love and obey them no matter what because they're getting a paycheck, and that's just simply not true. They're still autonomous, sovereign human beings who get to make up their mind and who get to call you out if they think that you are being shady or inconsistent or not doing the right thing. And so the way that an internal audience comes into play during a crisis is they can either be very, very helpful or very, very harmful. The very, very harmful version is you've lost the trust of your own team. So now you're really in trouble. Like anybody else who's mad at you, you can just tell them, well, you don't understand, you don't have all the facts. But people who work inside the company saying that they don't believe in you is a true catastrophe. So you've really done something wrong if you lose your internal audience and lose your connection with employees. The second way, which is, or I guess the first way, where employees are really, really helpful is they can be ambassadors on behalf of the company. And they can help, now that everybody's online, they can help be amplifying the real message that you want to get out. They can be showing solidarity and support. And in some situations, you can actually use a crisis to improve the morale among employees and kind of bind people more tightly together and unite them. But one thing I will say, just to emphasize this, is employees don't owe us really anything beyond their labor. Like they could go work in other places. And the fact that they are here doesn't mean that we get to take them for granted. Like they are forming opinions of leaders in every situation, and in a crisis, the biggest mistake is what do we tell the press? What do we tell the public? And neglecting to first inform employees when these are people who have bet their careers or their jobs on you as a leader, and you owe this to them to bring them along the journey and keep them in the loop.
You know, in talking to the internal audience, I'm curious from your perspective to know what have you found as to be sort of best practices in that regard, right? Because you can obviously send out a company-wide email, and then that's now something that can be potentially leaked, right? Or is it more like one-on-one communication, you know, get the whole organization together in like a town hall setting? How do you feel has been the best, most effective way to communicate internally?
Yeah, I am a town hall enjoyer. I know that the Navy does one, the Marines do one. There's different ones going around. So like no matter, my point there is that if they're not too large of an organization to do a town hall, nobody is too large or too lofty to hold town halls and to keep people updated. But the real magic and the real meaningful interactions are the day-to-day. You're not in a crisis, it's during peacetime, and it's just person to person, walk the halls, get to know specific individuals and get to really know them as people.
Right.
Sometimes people will say, I know my team and I know my employees. In aggregate, they are 42% this and 30%.
Yeah.
Name 3 of their kids, name 4 of their pets, name 10 of their hobbies. Like, you have to actually know the individual people, again, before there's a crisis.
Right.
And you have to establish a cadence of communications that when there's a crisis, it's not like, I haven't heard from this person in 6 months and now they want me to sit down and listen to what they have to say. That's annoying and disingenuous.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Where were you when
Yeah.
I had some great success in my life? Why weren't you giving me kudos then, right? Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you've been in the business for, when did you found your original company? If you don't mind saying the year.
Yeah, no, I was a co-founder. We started it in 2016.
Okay. So we're going on almost 10 years since
Yeah.
you started in this business. And then can you tell me how has Crisis Comms changed over that time?
The biggest changes, yeah, it's changed a lot. The biggest changes are 3 things, and they're kind of all connected. One is the speed, just the tempo at which you have to operate. 2 is social media versus media, and 3 is employees. So since we were just talking about employees, I'll start with 3, which is that employees are much more vocal, much more online. A lot of your employees will have their own independent brands and reputations that they are looking out for.
Right.
And then in sectors like AI, for example, they probably have 8 job offers sitting in their inbox. And so you really, truly can't take them for granted. So the employee base as spokespeople, beyond just the official spokespeople, is one big change. The second one, since we're going in reverse order, well, it'd be the second one either way, the rise of social media over traditional media. Traditional media still matters. You know, some people are like, mainstream media is dead, it's gone. No,
Right.
it still matters. It matters
sure,
to
absolutely.
regulators. It matters to investors. If you're selling to the government, it matters to your customers. So it's not nothing. But the rise of social media, I think, inarguably has overtaken it in terms of speed and importance. So anything can crop up from any corner of the internet. And anonymous accounts, where nobody, or pseudonymous accounts, where nobody even knows who the real person is,
Right.
can credibly spread information.
Sure.
So that's something to look out for. And then the final one is just the speed of things, you know, related to the rise of social media.
Yeah.
There's no business hours for information,
Nope.
good or bad.
Yeah.
And when memes take off, they'll take off in like an hour, and they'll have like this incredible mimetic power that is beyond anybody to put them back in the box. And so to just be reacting and having someone monitoring in real time is really crucial. Again, before a crisis starts, that should be happening.
Absolutely, 100%. Well, we do have a question from social media. So someone did rise to the occasion and give us a question which we're going to throw your way. So Andrew asks, from your experience, how closely do game developers, public relations teams work with platforms like Xbox, PlayStation, and Steam? What does that collaboration typically involve?
Very closely, and the partnerships are interwoven. It's not just one person, but it's like one person with these 3 people and these 2 people with these. Like sometimes with the larger teams, you have like team to team where multiple people know multiple people.
Right.
And the collaborations run a lot deeper. So we were talking about the importance of preparing for a crisis before it happens. Same thing for a launch. Like these preparations run months and months and months. I've seen like 9 months, a year before something actually launches.
Yeah.
People start preparing and talking about what they want it to be like.
You know, in that same respect, you know, I'm a big follower of game industry press, and so when I see a organization like IGN or one of these other publications put out something and they're promoting a game, talk to me a little about how that works from the PR perspective. You know, are you reaching out to them? Are they reaching out to you? How early and often is this sort of engagement getting started? How deep and involved in it is? And is there a sort of potential risk with, if you're going to do an exclusive with one company, how does that balance with other industry press?
Do you mean if you're going to do an exclusive with one outlet, how does it balance with
Yeah,
what
like
else
let's
the
say
company's
there's a new
doing?
game coming out, right?
Yeah.
And it's going to be a big game. It's a tentpole game, and you want to obviously get big media attention towards it. So again, I've seen from my side as the consumer the exclusive with a certain industry press company that's doing all kinds of in-depth interviews or exclusive gameplay reveals. How does that work from the public relations perspective?
It is very heavily dependent on relationships.
Okay.
And there are teams and reporters that go back way before I had any exposure to the industry, years and years, some decades.
Wow.
I worked with people who had been in the industry for decades and had known other people from like 4 jobs ago. And so a lot of this is based on relationships of who you like and trust. And do you want to give them preview access to the game? Do you want to let them come and take a tour? Do you want to let them come and meet the team? Or do you want to give them an exclusive where they're the only one? Like the level of access and how exclusive it is really depends on relationships a lot. Strategically, you also want to reach people who have larger platforms, who are more credible, of course. Within gaming, there's a wide range of people who are in the press, who are very credible, have a ton of followers, and they're believed when they say things, and then people who are not well respected, not as credible, and or have a more adversarial relationship. And so there's kind of this matrix of do you like them? Do you trust them? Do they matter? Do other people believe them? And then are you going just to them, or how broad are you going to go?
Yeah, no, absolutely. On that same note, do you find that there is perhaps maybe a shift in terms of who you give focus or attention to, maybe towards personalities? You see a lot of these Twitch streamers or other streamers that have very large audiences versus maybe the more traditional industry outlets. Like, is there a sort of give and take between those two groups? Are you shifting towards one or the other, or do you think that the more tried and true industry media perspective is still the way to go?
No, I think the shift towards influencers and individuals and personalities is very real. In tech, in gaming, in a lot of other sectors too. Again, people trust people more than institutions.
Sure.
And if there's one individual that you see and you form this parasocial relationship with them through their streams and their podcasts and their content, that can often be a lot more meaningful and substantive and influential than someone whose byline you see every once in a while. So when I was at Activision, a lot of things we would go with a heavy focus on influencers and streamers.
Yeah, absolutely. Since we've been talking about the future of this career field, of course, I don't think we can avoid the topic of artificial intelligence because it's pretty much everywhere nowadays. So how do you see artificial intelligence or AI affecting the community or the job or the career field from your perspective?
Yeah. I think everybody who is a communicator, whether it's in your title or not, like if you're a founder, you're a CEO, you are a communicator. And so everyone who has that as part of their job needs to be adapting to what we talked about earlier, the rise of social media, personalities over institutions, speed, your employees as spokespeople. And with speed especially, everything else seems to have sped up, but how much sleep I need hasn't changed, and how fast I can read something and how fast I can write something hasn't really changed. So there's a clear use case there for AI. I would say that in the near future, AI is going to be very, very transformative for communicators, and I think for the communications industry might even replace it entirely. Like it's going to be very impactful for communications. I do not think that we're there yet, and I think it's a mistake to use it as a crutch too early. AI writing still feels like AI writing. Now, there's really bad human writing that is worse than AI writing, but AI writing sounds fake. Like bad human writing, I might know that it's bad, but it was written by a person. And the reason that's relevant is in a crisis, when trust is so low, you can be forgiven by writing something poorly and having typos, but it was clearly written by you. You will not be forgiven if people found out that AI wrote it.
Right.
It's better to put out this typo-riddled quick draft from Apple Notes than to have something where people discover that it was ChatGPT. So I wouldn't over-rely on it right now. And then the other thing is for AI, it can create a lot of new if not crises, then tough situations, because there are
Sure.
bad actors, and bad actors will misuse any technology. I don't
Yeah.
think it's specific to AI, but they might use it to make fake things. They might use it to break the law. And society has not quite adapted to how to reckon with this technology. And so you might find yourself, you, a company, might find yourself being held accountable for what someone else did with
Yeah.
their own agency, with
Yeah.
a tool that you put out in good faith. And so just a lot of new vectors for negativity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Most recently, I saw, Coca-Cola put out an ad that used
Yeah.
generative video,
Yeah.
and that got a lot of bad press recently. But ultimately, they decided to make that decision. It was interesting to see how they did that, but obviously, there's something that they got some flack for.
Yeah.
DINFOS Live is all about continuing education, right? This is what we emphasize on this program, and so I always like to go to our guests and say, do you have any resources or books or other sort of things that you would recommend our audience perhaps check out so they can help strengthen their own communication capabilities?
Your audience might have already read this book. I think it's on a fair number of reading lists, but
Sure.
Killer Angels.
Oh, no, never heard of that.
Killer Angels by Michael Shara is it's about the Battle of Gettysburg, just a span of a few days. And what's special about it is that it's told as if it's a novel, and each of the senior officers is a character where it's focused on the personalities. So it talks about the formations and the tactics, but mostly it talks about the psychology of Longstreet and the psychology of Lee and the psychology of Pickett and how they interact. The reason that I think it's so good for communications is there are men in this situation who ran into a storm of bullets because their leader told them to.
Yeah.
And how much trust and faith and morale it must take to muster that many men to run forward into oncoming bullets is hard to fathom. But the book gets at it by talking about what the leaders did and said to win or lose the confidence of their people.
Wow.
And since I think internal comms is the most important thing, this book is probably the closest thing that analyzes how a leader gets people to follow them.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Well, thank you for that recommendation. And thank you again for your time. Really appreciate it. Before we say goodbye to you, is there anything else you'd like to add?
An external crisis is inconvenient, and an internal crisis is existential. So internal always, always comes first.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you again for your time, Lulu. Really appreciate it. And of course, that is our show for this month. And of course, besides thanking our guest for being on the program, I of course want to thank all of you for tuning in, and thank you for the question, Andrew. We always appreciate any questions from the audience. And remember, if you'd prefer to listen to our show rather than watch it, know that DINFOS Live is also a podcast, and you can find it on your podcatcher of choice. Just search for DINFOS Live. Join us next month on December 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern, when we'll be talking all about the Mobile Training Team program here at the Defense Information School with the program's owner, Mrs. Mel Weatherspoon. All right, well, for everyone at DINFOS and the Defense Media Activity, I'm Major David J. Murphy, and we'll see you all next month. Bye, everybody. Well, that was great. Thanks so much for your time.